The backhoe idled like a tired animal in the long Tennessee grass, and Earl Whitaker, 73 years old, gaunt as a fence post and weathered the color of saddle leather, narrowed his pale eyes at the termite mound rising 8 feet tall in the middle of his back pasture. His old blue-tick hound, a dog named Patton, was circling the base of that red clay tower, hackles up, low whine in his throat, refusing to come when Earl whistled. The mound had not been there 10 years ago. It had not been there 5 years ago. Now it stood like a cathedral of dirt, hollowed and humming with a million tiny soldiers, and the hayfield around it had gone yellow because the roots could not breach the hard red shell the termites built. Earl tugged the brim of his sweat-stained VFW ball cap, rubbed the white stubble on his jaw, and spat into the dust. He had told his nephew on the phone the night before that he was going to knock the thing down come morning, and morning had come, and the dog would not stop circling. Stay with me on this one. Earl Whitaker had been born on that farm in 1952, the only son of Harlan Whitaker, and the grandson of a man whose name was carved into a marble slab at the VFW hall in town, a man Earl had never met. The grandfather, Silas Whitaker, had marched off to France in 1944 with the 29th Infantry Division and had never come home. Earl had served his own time in Vietnam, 67 to 69, and had come back with a Purple Heart and a tremor in his left hand. He did not talk about the war. He did not talk about his grandfather. The mound, though, the mound he was going to talk about, because the mound was costing him 3 acres of hay. He climbed into the cab of the backhoe, an old yellow Case 830 he had bought used in 1984, and the diesel coughed and caught. Patton sat down 10 feet from the mound and looked at Earl with the kind of look a dog gives a man when the man is about to do something bigger than it looks. Earl lowered the bucket and rolled toward the red tower. The first scoop took the top off the mound, sent a brown cloud of insects boiling into the May sunlight. The second scoop opened the throat of the thing, revealed the gray tunnels honeycombed inside, and the third scoop hit something that was not dirt. The bucket clanged. Earl set the brake. He climbed down. Patton was already there, nose in the gash Earl had cut into the side of the mound, tail rigid, body trembling. Earl crouched beside the dog, brushed at the loose red soil with the side of his boot, and saw a corner of something dark and metallic, the size of a brick, half buried in the dirt the termites had piled on top of it. He knelt. He took the folding knife from his pocket. He scraped the dirt away in slow, careful strokes, the way a man scrapes the rust off a hinge he intends to use again, and the corner became an edge, and the edge became a side, and the side became the top of a box. It was an ammunition can, the old kind, M1901, olive drab paint mostly gone, stenciling on the lid faded but still legible if you knew where to look. Cal 30. Earl read it twice. Then he read the second line, smaller, almost erased by 60 years of weather and worm and red Tennessee mud. U.S. Army. He sat back on his heels in the dust and the broken termite mound, and he felt the morning go very quiet around him. Patton whined once and lay down with his chin on his front paws, and watched Earl the way the dog had watched him at his wife Marlene's funeral 4 years back. Earl stood up, dusted off the knees of his wranglers, and walked the 50 yards back to the truck for a shovel and his cell phone. He came back. He widened the hole. Earl's left hand began to tremble in a way it had not trembled in 20 years. He sat down on the tailgate and called his nephew Wyatt, a sheriff's deputy in the next county over, and he said, "Son, I need you to come out to the farm." Wyatt asked if Earl was all right. Earl said he was fine. Earl said it was about Granddaddy Silas. Wyatt said he would be there in 40 minutes. Earl poured a cup of coffee from the thermos. He thought about how his daddy Harlan had walked this same pasture for 57 years and never once mentioned anything buried in it. The sun climbed. The cicadas started up in the tree line. Patton got up and lay back down between Earl and the can, as if he understood that the next stretch of time was a stretch a man should not have to wait through alone. Earl thought about Silas Whitaker, the man whose face he knew only from one cracked photograph on the parlor mantel, a tall, lean fellow in a wool uniform somewhere in England in 1944, faint smile under the shadow of an M1 helmet. The Army had sent home a telegram in December of '44. The Army had sent home a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart in 1946. The Army had never sent home a body. Silas Whitaker was listed as missing in action near the Hurchin Forest, presumed killed, and the Whitaker family had folded that grief into the wood of the house and carried on. Wyatt's cruiser came up the gravel drive at 12:47. The young deputy climbed out and walked across the pasture in his pressed uniform. He stopped at the edge of the hole. He looked at the ammunition can. He looked at his uncle. "Uncle Earl," he said, "what in the world?" Earl crouched beside the can, and with the tip of his folding knife he worked at the latch. The latch was rusted but not seized. It came up with a small dry click. Earl looked at Wyatt. Wyatt nodded. Earl did not open the lid yet. He breathed. A man who has been in combat knows that there are doors in a life which, once opened, do not close again. Earl had crossed that kind of threshold in Vietnam in '68, and again the night he lost Marlene, and he recognized the feeling now, that particular stillness in the chest. He thought about reburying the can, knocking the rest of the mound flat and seeding the pasture, and going on with his Tuesday night VFW meetings until his time came. Then he reached out and opened the lid. But before I tell you what was inside that can, I have to tell you about Silas Whitaker, because the man in the photograph on the parlor mantel was not the man the Army told the family he was, and the story that was about to come up out of that hole had been waiting 60 years to be told, and a story like that deserves to be told in the right order. So bear with me. We are going to walk back to 1944 for a minute, and then we are going to come back to Earl on his tailgate, and we are going to open the box together. Silas Whitaker was 27 years old when he shipped out of Camp Shelby, Mississippi, in March of 1944. He left a wife named Beatrice and a 4-year-old son named Harlan and a hayfield in Tennessee that had been in the family since 1881. He had carried a .3006 Springfield he had hunted whitetail with since he was 16, but the Army gave him a Garand. He wrote home about Beatrice's biscuits, about the smell of the hayfield in July, about a corporal from Vermont who could play harmonica. He wrote them like a man who knew the letters had to do the work of his hands and his eyes and his voice for a long time, maybe forever. He landed at Omaha Beach in the second wave on the 6th of June 1944. He fought through the hedgerows of Normandy in the summer. He marched across France in the autumn. By November he was in Belgium, and by the first week of December he was on the German border, in the gray dripping pines of the Hurchin Forest, where the trees burst overhead under artillery fire. The 29th Division was not officially in the Hurchin, but elements of it were attached out to support the 1st and the 8th, and Silas Whitaker had been pulled with a small detachment to a position near a village called Schmidt, where, according to the telegram, he had gone missing on the 8th of December 1944. That was the Army's version. That was the version Beatrice received in her kitchen on a Tuesday morning a week before Christmas. Missing. Presumed killed. Hurchin Forest. December 1944. Old Glory folded into a triangle at a memorial service with no body to bury. The family carried on. Harlan grew up. Harlan married Ruth. Harlan and Ruth had Earl. Earl went to Vietnam. Earl came home. Earl married Marlene. Earl buried Marlene. And underneath all of it, 3 feet down in the red Tennessee soil at the edge of the back pasture, the can waited. Now we go back to the tailgate. Now we open the lid. Earl lifted the lid of the M19, a 1-ammunition can with the slow, careful motion of a man diffusing something he loves, and the inside of the can was dry, sealed tight by 60 years of paint and gasket and luck, and the first thing he saw was a folded square of oilcloth, the size of a paperback book, tied with brown twine. He lifted it out. He set it on the tailgate. He looked into the can. Beneath where the oilcloth had been there was a second item, a small flat tin box, the kind a man might keep tobacco in, and beneath that, wrapped in a strip of canvas, was a third item, long and slender, that Earl already knew was a pair of dog tags before he ever touched them. He left those for last. He untied the brown twine on the oilcloth. He unfolded the cloth. Inside was a stack of letters, 23 of them by Wyatt's later count, tied in their own bundle with a faded red ribbon, the ink on the outside envelope still legible. They were addressed to Beatrice Whitaker, Route 2, Whitaker Farm, Tennessee. They were stamped with the franking mark of the United States Army. None of them had been mailed. None of them had ever been sent. Earl set the bundle down. His hand was trembling now, openly, the old Vietnam tremor he had learned to hide for 50 years, and he did not try to hide it. He picked up the tin tobacco box. He opened it. Inside, neatly folded, was a single sheet of yellowed paper, typed on a manual typewriter, the carbon faded but readable, and it was a copy of a sworn statement, signed in the bottom right corner with the name Silas H. Whitaker, and dated the 2nd of December 1944, 6 days before he was reported missing. Earl read the first line. He read it again. He looked at Wyatt. Wyatt was watching his uncle's face the way a deputy watches a man who has just been told something that is going to change his life, and Wyatt said, "What does it say, Uncle Earl?" And Earl said, in a voice that was steadier than his hand, "Son, your great-granddaddy was not killed at the Hurchin Forest. Your great-granddaddy walked away from it. But that is only half of the story, and the smaller half. To understand what was on that sheet of paper, and what was in those 23 unmailed letters, and what was on the third object in the can, we have to talk about what was happening in a town called Stavelot, Belgium, on the 17th of December 1944, 9 days after Silas Whitaker was reported missing from a forest 200 miles to the south. Because Silas Whitaker, according to the typed statement now lying on the tailgate of a Ford pickup in Tennessee, had walked away from the Hurchin Forest under the orders of a major whose name had been blacked out with a censor's pen, and Silas Whitaker had been moved, alive and wounded, across the Belgian border to a small frame house outside Stavelot. And Silas Whitaker had been there on the morning of the 17th of December 1944, when the lead elements of Kampfgruppe paper came up the road out of the fog, and Silas Whitaker had not been alone in that house. He had been there with 3 civilians, a Belgian woman and her 2 daughters, ages 9 and 12, whom he had been ordered to protect. Earl read the statement twice. He passed it to Wyatt. Wyatt read it and set it down carefully on the tailgate. Wyatt, who had read a lot of statements in his years as a deputy, said only, "Lord have mercy." The statement was 3 paragraphs. It described how a wounded American infantryman, designated only as Sergeant W., had been quartered in the home of a widow named Mathilda Verlinden at the request of a major identified only as Major B, and had been left there with strict orders to defend the household against any approaching German forces. The statement described how Sergeant W. had concealed himself and the 3 civilians in the root cellar at first light on the 17th of December, when the sound of half-tracks came up the valley. How a unit of Waffen SS infantry had searched the house, had not found the cellar, had set fire to the upper floor, and had moved on. How Sergeant W. had pulled the 3 civilians out through a coal chute and across a snow-covered field, and had carried the youngest girl, who could not walk, on his back for 2 miles to a barn where a Belgian farmer named Henry Lacroix took them in. The statement was signed Silas H. Whitaker. The statement was dated, by Silas's own hand, the 2nd of December, which was 6 days before he had supposedly disappeared. Which meant the statement had been written before the event it described. Which meant the statement had been added to, later, in another hand. Which meant, Earl Whitaker said quietly into the May afternoon, that somebody had been writing this thing in pieces. He picked up the bundle of unmailed letters. He untied the red ribbon. He lifted the top letter off the stack. He saw that the first letter was dated November 28, 1944, and addressed to Beatrice, and he sat down on the tailgate beside his nephew, and he began, very slowly, to read. The letters were not love letters, though love was in them. The letters were a man explaining himself to his wife in case he never made it home. The first described Silas's transfer from the 29th to a small ad hoc unit under a major named Bennett, pulled together for irregular work the censors would never have passed. The second described the night Silas and 4 other men had been driven in a covered truck across the Belgian border. The third described Mathilde Verlinden, the Belgian widow whose husband had been killed at Liege in 1940, and her 2 daughters, Margox, who was 12, and Colette, who was 9, and the small frame house at the edge of Stavelot. The fourth described the morning of the 17th of December, the sound of the half-tracks, the smell of the smoke, and the weight of a 9-year-old girl on his back across 2 miles of snow. Earl read for an hour. The cicadas in the tree line rose and fell. Wyatt read every letter after Earl was done with it. The letters covered 7 weeks. The last was dated January 19, 1945. In it, Silas explained that Major Bennett had been killed at a crossroads near Hoefeleis on the 2nd of January, that the ad hoc unit had been scattered, that Silas himself had been wounded in the leg by a shell fragment near Bastogne, and that he had been taken by a French-speaking Belgian doctor named Henry to a farmhouse outside the village of Taverny. The doctor had told Silas that the 29th had listed him as missing in action, and that no one in the United States Army knew he was alive. The doctor had asked Silas what he wanted to do. The letter described, in Silas's own steady handwriting, what he had decided. He had decided not to go home. Earl Whitaker, 73 years old, sat on the tailgate of his pickup in the May sunlight in Tennessee and read his grandfather's reasoning in his grandfather's hand, and felt the weight of 60 years of family silence settle around his shoulders like a coat. Silas had written that he could not go home. Silas had written that he had failed. Silas had written that Mathilde Verlinden had died of pneumonia in the cellar of the Lacroix barn on the night of the 23rd of December 1944, that Margox, the older daughter, had died of the same fever on the 27th, and that only Colette, 9 years old, had survived, and Colette was now alone in the world. Silas had written that he had promised Mathilde, on the night she died, that he would see to the child. Silas had written that he could not see to the child from Tennessee. Silas had written that if he went home, he would carry the weight of 2 graves in a Belgian field for the rest of his life, and he would not be able to look at Beatrice or at the boy Harlan without flinching, and that flinching, he wrote, would be a worse thing to bring home than no man at all. He had decided to stay. He had decided to let the Army's mistake stand. He had decided to raise the child Colette as best he could, in the small farmhouse outside Taverny, under the name of a dead Belgian cousin of the Lacroix family, and he had decided to write Beatrice the truth, in 23 letters which he could not bring himself to send, and to put those letters and the typed statement and a single object he could not part with into an ammunition can, and to give that can to a friend named Henry Lacroix with one instruction. If I live to be an old man, Silas wrote in the final letter, I will come home one day and tell my Beatrice and my Harlan the truth with my own mouth. If I do not, Henry, please find a way to get this can to my farm in Tennessee. Bury it where the hayfield meets the tree line, where the boy will not find it as a child, but where the man he becomes will not be able to avoid it forever. Tell no one. The rest I will leave to God and to the slow, honest work of the years. Earl set the last letter down on the tailgate. He did not speak for a long time. The sun had moved across the sky. Patton's tail thumped once against his thigh. Wyatt finally said, quietly, Uncle Earl, what was the third thing in the can? Earl had forgotten for a moment about the dog tags. He reached into the can. He drew out the strip of canvas. He unwound it. He laid the contents on the tailgate. There were 2 dog tags on a single beaded chain, the steel clouded with 60 years of oilcloth and dry Tennessee earth, but the stamping still clean and readable. WHITKR, SILASH. The serial number. The blood type O positive. The faith mark P for Protestant. They were the standard issue, the same as Earl's own from Vietnam, now hanging on a nail by the back door of the farmhouse. But they were not alone. Beside the dog tags on the canvas lay a folded scrap of paper, no larger than a playing card, brown with age, soft as cloth. Earl opened it with the same careful fingers he had used on the latch. Inside was a child's drawing in pencil of 3 figures standing in front of a small house. A woman tall in a long dress. A girl smaller. A man in a soldier's helmet holding the girl's hand. Underneath, in a wavering 9-year-old's print in French, was written, "Pour Papa Silas de Colette." For Papa Silas from Colette. Earl Whitaker put his face in his hands and he wept, in the dry red dust at the edge of the broken termite mound, for a man he had never known and a child his grandfather had saved, and a family he had not known he had. Patton put his head on Earl's knee. Wyatt looked away, gave his uncle the dignity of the moment, and stared out across the yellow hayfield toward the tree line where, 60 years before, a Belgian farmer named Henry Lacroix had walked across an ocean and a war and a continent of family silence to bury a can in the soft red earth and let the world's slowest mailman, a colony of termites, build a tower over the top of it to mark the spot. That evening, on the porch of the Whitaker farmhouse, Earl spread the letters out on the long pine table his grandfather had built in 1938, and he and Wyatt began to read them aloud, in order, from first to last, while the lightning bugs came up out of the hayfield and Patton lay across the threshold. They read about Mathilde Verlinden. They read about Margox and Colette. They read about the night in the cellar and the morning across the snow. They read about Major Bennett and the crossroads at Hoofelies. They read about the doctor in Taverny and the small frame farmhouse and the slow recovery of a wounded American sergeant who, on the day he could finally walk again, looked at the orphaned 9-year-old girl asleep on a straw mattress in the corner, and understood that going home would be a kind of second death for everyone involved. The next morning, Earl drove into town and he walked into the VFW hall, the bell over the door jangling, and he laid the letters and the typed statement and the dog tags and the child's drawing on the green felt of the pool table, and he asked the post commander, an old Korean War veteran named Gus Lemon, to help him find Colette. Gus Lemon looked at the drawing for a long time. Gus Lemon picked up the phone. Within a week, with the help of a Belgian historian and an archivist at the American Battle Monuments Commission, the family had a name. Colette Lacroix, born 1935 in Stavelot, raised in Taverny, married a man named Pierre Dumont in 1957. 3 children, 7 grandchildren, retired schoolteacher, living in a small town outside Liège. Earl flew to Belgium in September. He had never been on an airplane that flew over water. He carried the Bronze Star and the Purple Heart in a small black case in the inside pocket of his jacket, and he carried a folded American flag, Old Glory, that the VFW had given him on the night before he left. He landed in Brussels in the rain. He took a train. He took a taxi. He arrived at a small stone house with red geraniums in the window boxes on a quiet street outside Liège, and he raised a trembling hand to the brass knocker. The door was opened by a small white-haired woman in a blue cardigan with bright brown eyes, and she looked at him for a long moment and she said, in careful English, "You are the grandson." Earl could not speak. She took his hand. She pulled him gently inside. They sat at her kitchen table for 9 hours. She had photographs. She had her own letters in Silas's hand, from the 50s and 60s, when he had been a quiet handyman in Taverny under the name Sylvain Lacroix, letters she had found after his death in 1971. She had a small worn Bible with the name Beatrice Whitaker pressed into the inside cover. She had a black and white photograph from 1960 of a tall, gaunt American with white hair and the same pale eyes as Earl's, standing in front of a small frame farmhouse with a young woman in a wedding dress, his arm around her shoulders, smiling the same faint smile from the mantel photograph. He had walked her down the aisle. He had been her father. Earl gave Colette the bundle of unmailed letters. He gave her the typed statement. He kept the dog tags, because the dog tags were the last thing of his grandfather's that belonged to the Tennessee side of the family, and because some things a grandson is allowed to keep. He gave her the child's drawing. She held it in her small hands, and she touched the helmet on the drawn soldier with one finger, and she said softly, "Papa Silas." She said it the way a daughter says the name of a father, 60 years gone, who never stopped being her father. Earl looked at this woman, 70 years old, who would have been his great-aunt or his cousin or his half-sister or some new kind of family the English language did not yet have a word for, and he understood, finally, why his grandfather had not come home. He stayed in Belgium for 10 days. He met Colette's 3 children and 7 grandchildren, his cousins by a kind of love that did not require blood. He walked with Colette through Taverny, past the small stone church where Silas had been buried in 1971 under the name Sylvain Lacroix, and Earl knelt at the grave and laid the folded American flag on the headstone, the red and white and blue bright against the gray Belgian stone, and he said, in a voice that was almost steady, "You can come home now, Granddaddy. You did right. You can rest." He left the flag and the bronze star on the grave. He kept the Purple Heart, because his grandfather would have wanted his own grandson to carry it. He flew home to Tennessee in October. He walked the fence line at sunrise with his thermos and Patton at his heel. He flattened what was left of the mound and reseeded the 3 acres in winter rye, and by the following May the hayfield was green again all the way to the tree line, and you would not have known anything had ever stood there but grass. But on a small shelf inside the Whitaker farmhouse, beside the cracked photograph from the mantel, there sits now a child's pencil drawing of 3 figures in front of a small house, and a pair of clouded steel dog tags on a beaded chain, and on the wall above the shelf there hangs a framed letter, the last one Silas Whitaker ever wrote, dated January 19th, 1945, in which a young wounded American sergeant explained, to a wife he loved and a son he would never see again, why he was choosing to stay in a small farmhouse in Belgium with an orphaned 9-year-old girl. And every Sunday morning before church, Earl Whitaker, 73 years old and gone as a fence post and weathered the color of saddle leather, stops at that shelf and he touches the dog tags, and he says quietly, so that only the dog can hear him, "Thank you, Granddaddy." Some stories are buried for a reason. Some stories are buried because a man does not yet have the words. Some stories are buried because the words would break the people who would have to hear them. And some stories, the slowest and the truest of them, are buried in a red Tennessee hayfield in 1945 by a Belgian farmer named Henry Lacroix, and left for a colony of termites to build a tower over, like a cathedral of dirt, like a monument no one yet knows is a monument, so that one day in May of 2026, a 73-year-old veteran can climb into an old yellow backhoe with a tremor in his left hand, and a blue tick hound named Patton at his heel. And finally, hear his grandfather's voice come up out of the ground. If you have a grandfather, or a father, or a brother, or an uncle, or a son who served, take a minute today and call him. Take a minute today and ask him what he has not yet been able to say. The slow, honest work of the years is the only mailman some letters ever get, and the years are shorter than we think. Old Glory still flies above the porch of the Whitaker farmhouse in Tennessee, and Patton the blue tick hound still sleeps across the threshold at night, and out in the back pasture, where a termite mound once stood 8 feet tall over a secret 60 years old, the hayfield is green again, and quiet, and full at last of nothing but grass, and sunlight, and the wind, and the long, slow, honest piece of a story finally told.